Hey, this is Mark A. Altman.
And this is Darren Doctorman, and we are the inglorious
Treksperts. And we're joined today by two of my favorite Treksperts. There's the writer of Thor and X-Men First Class, and just a lovely gentleman who you've come to know over these last few years, Ashley Edward Miller.
I can't believe I'm here again.
And beaming down from his observatory in a secret location somewhere in Southern California. And he got this very nautical looking beard. Gene Roddenberry would approve. It's a man full of observations. It's none other than Robert Meyer Burnett.
It is great to be here. And I just like to point out, Mark, that Ashley Edward Miller has his third season of DOTA Dragon's Blood dropping soon.
It's true, I do.
Well, somebody better catch it. I'm done.
August 11th on a Netflix.
Oh my God, it
is
is soon.
Yeah.
Wow. So that's if you haven't been watching on the Netflix,
now's the time to catch up.
Now's the time before you cancel Netflix to make sure you watch all of DOTA Dragon's Blood. It's third season debuting this August. Check it out.
Right. Just don't make it look like you canceled the service because
no.
My
You
show.
got it. No. I'm just apparently that's what people are doing. You know,
Yeah.
they're canceling. I don't know. I'm not canceling my Netflix. I like my Netflix.
Me neither.
Too.
and
Yeah.
Rob's beard is very Marco Ramius.
It is.
Yes.
He looks like he should be, defecting with the Red October.
When Cortez went to the New World, he brought his ships.
Yeah. You remember, well, anyway, we're not going to start talking about Red October because that will be that'll be a Byzantine trail that we will never make our way back. It'll be
It's
like
a very Star Trek movie, though.
It definitely.
Well, we've had that conversation. Of course, it's the perfect Star Trek movie. That's not a Star Trek movie. Although it's Crimson Tide or Red October, a better Star Trek movie.
You know what Crimson Tide is?
And I'm not saying what's the better movie. I'm saying what's a better Star Trek movie. I think it's Crimson Tide too.
I do too, because you have the conflict of two men at the heart of it, and whereas I think Red October is much more of an adventure story, a sprawling adventure tale, but Crimson Tide, has two men locked.
Well,
Yeah.
more than that, it has two men who are both right.
Yes,
Yeah, exactly. And they are,
It makes it essentially at its core.
and it's what's
Core,
about what's
KOR,
happening between
a
them,
Star
not
Trek
what's
story.
happening outside of them.
yes.
We got an interesting show for the listeners at home this week. We're gonna, we've done a bunch of interesting shows the last couple of weeks. We had the lovely Terry Matalas on a couple of weeks talking about Picard season 3, which we're actually all very excited about. A lot of good things in the air.
For good reason.
Yeah, and I'm
I
excited
hope
about
that's
that.
true.
And then because all we were saying is give Terry a chance. And then we got last week a really sad episode. Of course, we talked about the passing of a sci-fi legend, Greg Jean, which I have to say, Darren, we got a very nice response to through the interwebs.
I'm glad because that was an emotional episode for us, and I'm glad that people got to share a little bit in his life.
I kind of was like, I don't care if 6 people listen to this. We're doing this. This is worthwhile. We need to do this. And the response has just been, I got a bunch of emails and people reaching out, and then, on the Twitter and everything. So that was, I'm really glad.
Very nice episode, you guys. Well done.
Oh, thanks, Rob. Yeah, it's important. It's important to honor these sci-fi legends, because they're not actors, and for a lot of people, it's all about the actors.
Yeah.
And for us, it's not. But so we thought it'd be fun for a little change of pace this week, to go back to the 1970s, and talk about where fandom sort of met professionalism. Like there's something I think that people miss about, remember Next Generation, they would have the open submission policy where anyone potentially could sell a script to start. And it was very exciting. A lot of people got their start. People like Ron Moore, sold the script. People like Renee Echeverria, got their big break on Star Trek. But long before that, long before Pillars Open Door, there was, obviously, and Rob will let you set the table for this, but in the 70s, the fanzines, the Star Trek fanzines, and a lot of these people involved in these started to publish professionally. And of course, one of the people who was their mentor at the time was, Frederick Pohl, the great sci-fi author of the Gateway series and so many other great books. And was running Bantam and had so much success with the Star Trek IP back then that, you know, and they ran out of stuff to publish, you know, with the James Blish books and then later the Alan Dean Foster books. And there was a hunger to find new material. So who did they turn to, Rob?
Well, there were two women. You want to talk about Sandra Marshak and the women, Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbreth, who many people know from their own Star Trek novels that they wrote later. They were great purveyors of Star Trek fan fiction. And in, I believe it's 1976, they edited the very first collection. It was a collection of Star Trek short stories that was basically written by fans. And it was called Star Trek: The New Voyages. And there was also Star Trek: The New Voyages 2. But they compiled this, and in that particular book, there were two real standout stories. One that I've never forgotten, which is Mind Sifter, and then the other is, I think, something we would like to be talking about today called Visit to a Small Planet Revisited.
Oh, there's a weird planet.
Now, Darren, I gotta ask you.
Small rights. It was a riff on that Visit to a Small Planet.
Darren, is it fair to say this was the splinter of the mind's eye of Star Trek, or was that Spock Must Die?
You know, it's tough to say, because in the Star Wars universe, there really wasn't a swelling of fan fiction, at least at the beginning.
Right.
But I mean, in terms of the impact of like, wow, new stories in this universe, because of course Spock Must Die was really not very good. And this, I feel like, touched people's imagination. Maybe it was just me in a more profound way.
To a certain faction of fans, absolutely. I didn't discover this stuff until much later, because I just wasn't in that realm. I didn't start buying the
1976,
book.
baby.
Yeah. No, I was still enjoying the video-ness of it all. But yeah, I didn't get into the books until years later. But I will say that the creativity and the originality that these particular group of stories showed was really a faction of not having Star Trek around. And that was one of the blessings of that, you know, the vast desert of years between the original series and the motion picture. It's that fandom really stepped up and filled in the blanks.
Well, what's interesting, speaking of fandom, was, of course, this was their follow-up to Star Trek Lives, which was a nonfiction book about the conventions. Because back then, you had Making of Star Trek and David Gerrold's Trouble with Tribbles and The World of Star Trek, and then they came out with Star Trek Lives, which was interesting, which really was, you know, the first professionally published thing about the phenomena of Star Trek fans and Star Trek conventions. Although there was the book about Star Trek, magazine about Star Trek fan clubs about this time too, which was pre-Starlog. But I want to ask Ashley, because Ashley, obviously you're a little younger than us in human years, and
Not in dog years.
I got to ask you, obviously this book looms very large for us in our initial Star Trek fandom. Is it something you were familiar with, or did you just learned about when we said we were going to do a show on this topic?
Oh, no. I totally knew what this stuff was. Although I came into all of the Bantam stuff through all of the whatever the line was, the entropy effect kicked off the
Timescape.
Yes, exactly. The Timescape line of books. And I still have the entropy effect, the very first edition, sitting in a place of honor on my shelf. That was really how I came into
through the Pocket, when Pocket got the license.
Yeah, exactly. I think the first Star Trek novel I read was the novelization of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. And then I started reading. And then when I ran out of those, I realized that there were other books that had been published. So then I went back and I found these stories. Of course, at the time, I didn't quite process that it was fan fiction, basically, that had been published. Like that
most of it had been in
cross my mind,
like Spockanalia.
That didn't scan for me at all. Like I had no idea what that meant. As far as I knew, it was just stories that people had written about Star Trek that I was excited to read.
Well, I have to say that for me, You know, now there is there's a definite line between it, this is all considered tie-in fiction, and it's really, they consider it marketing at the studio level.
Right.
But at the time, because there was only 3 seasons of the original Star Trek and then the animated series, to me, this was real Star Trek. Even though, like, in my mind, I was like, this isn't fan fiction. This was sanctioned by Paramount.
Right.
And in Star Trek: The New Voyages, all of the stories had introductions written by the actors. Leonard Nimoy had written an introduction to Navarre, and Intersection Point had a James Doohan introduction. Nichelle Nichols wrote an introduction. Majel Barrett Roddenberry wrote an introduction. George Takei,
Or
DeForest
Gene
Kelly,
wrote it for Majel.
or Gene wrote for Majel. And then William Shatner somebody wrote it for Bill, wrote the introduction to Mind Sifter,
which was written by Shirley Mayeski, who was the president of the Bill Shatner fan club at the time.
And it's that story is incredible. And for those who don't know, that basically the Klingons they've used the Guardian of Forever and stranded Kirk back in time without his memory. And it's basically One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in a way, where he's in an asylum. And it was, you know, reading these stories as a kid, I first got this book. My mom packed this book in my luggage when I went to the YMCA summer camp, Camp Orkyla on Orcas Island. And when I opened up my luggage to unpack when I got to camp, that book was sitting on top of my clothes. And my mom had packed it. I'm like, oh my God. Like, I didn't want to do any camp activity. I wanted to just read this book. And it was like,
is that when you learned how to fight, Rob? Because you had to?
Well, we did learn how to, yes, we did learn how to shoot 22s, and we learned archery as well.
Nice.
I don't know if they do that anymore, but
that's how it became the Green Arrow. Just don't tell anybody.
Yeah. But it was, you know, for a huge fan like myself, this was a year after the Star Trek blueprints and the Starfleet technical manual had been released. And to me, that was very legitimizing. Like, the technical manual, even though it wasn't necessarily canon, and the Enterprise blueprints weren't, sure they were
canon in my mind.
That's exactly right. And it was, so in my mind as a young, you know, I was what was I in 76? I was 9. So these books were Star Trek. Like, if you tried to explain to my 9-year-old self, well, they're not really, I'd be like, wait, what are you talking about? They absolutely were real Star Trek. And they were,
there's a bowling alley on the Enterprise. God damn it.
There was, like, Kevin Riley talked about it. There was a Dan, you know, but it was real. Yeah. And there was no differentiation in my mind. It was just, this just happened to be Star Trek stories in another medium. So you couldn't tell us that it wasn't real.
Well, I think what it did is it lit the wick of imagination.
Oh yeah.
Because, you know, there was no other Star Trek there likely to be any more Star Trek. So the fact that, you know, at this point you were just rewatching the original episodes of the animated series, these were all new adventures. And I do think that it was really exciting. You know, what's interesting about these, particularly this New Voyages, is if you look, it's all women who are the authors of all these stories. And I wonder why. What do you think the appeal was that is so leaned so heavily towards women at the time? Because I would say that certainly the people that are making fan films and writing, you know, on Wattpad and all that, the demo is probably more evenly spread out. And it's just, but it seems like Star Trek fandom, especially in its infancy, was much more female oriented than male.
You know what I wonder if it's less about whether more women were writing these stories than more women were sharing their stories. If you understand, in the sense that I think, you know, for when you're a geek and you're a boy, it's a little bit isolating. I mean, you find your tribe, but there's an expectation
to yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that women, especially then, I think, like, tend to be more open with each other about the things that they're interested in. I think that it's a different point of view on how to handle their fandom. And I think you even see that now. It's just that I think that that female fans are much more expressive in terms of how they engage with the material. I feel like they're more likely to write stories. I feel like they're more likely to be artists, to do cosplay, to do all. I mean, not that men don't do those things, But there is something of that communal experience that I think is more geared towards women sharing than it is towards men sharing.
That's a very good point.
I also think, though, that the male characters in Star Trek were the kind of people that women wanted to meet and be with, because coming out of the 60s, we still had the Western archetype was still looming large on TV, like with Bonanza and things like that. And, you know, the characters on Star Trek were men of action, but they weren't, you know, like in an episode like Balance of Terror, you would see McCoy come in and have a conversation with Kirk. Kirk would say, "Why me?" and show that he has vulnerabilities.
Sure.
And McCoy would give him some advice. And these were men. That's why women loved the character of Spock. You know, they're like, if only I could be with him, I could open him up, you know, and show that he has this emotional side. And I think that the reason that Star Trek had a big contingent of female fans was the men were very appealing as well-rounded, capable individuals that weren't just sort of one-note archetypes that had been portrayed on screen for so long.
Yeah,
especially on television.
I absolutely wouldn't discount the fact that one of the main architects of Star Trek was a woman, was Dorothy Fontana.
Yes.
And I think that the knowledge of that was not only encouraging, but inspiring.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's a really good point. And I have to say, it's so interesting if you look at this era where the fandom and the professionalism and the pros were not as bifurcated. It wasn't like this is fan fiction,
Right.
and these are pros, because if you look, it was the same year that the Inside Star Trek record album came out, 1976.
Mhm.
And that was you know, all the actors and Gene talking about doing Star Trek in this book. Like you said, every chapter,
How much of Bill Shatner is Captain Kirk?
every chapter is introduced by a Star Trek actor leading into the short story. There was much more of you know, an interaction between cast and you know, and the fans, and they all had fan clubs, and they all had, you know, really, I think, good relationships with their fan clubs. You know, they were very, you know, actively involved in those. I mean, the book begins with a foreword by Gene Roddenberry, where he says, "Those of us who were involved in making Star Trek are proud of our creation. There are things we might have done differently, and certainly there are things we might have done better, but we tried to always make it the very best we could under the circumstances of the television system, budget, time, fatigue, personal talent, and other restrictions facing us." And then he says, "Star Trek was not a one-man job, although it was something that was very personal to me. My own statement of who and what the species of ours really is, where we are now, and something of where we may be going. Have always been particularly grateful that Star Trek became an equally personal and meaningful thing to so many others." And, you know, this is the Gene we love, right? Isn't it? That's Gene right there that we love. You know, little humble and proud of his creation, and, you know, a visionary who made this crazy thing happen that we're talking about 55 years later.
And also, too, Star Trek hadn't become Star Trek. You know, it was, we were just a few, you're looking at, what was it, 7 years since the show had gone off the air. You had had the animated series, but beyond that, the viability of it as an ongoing concern was not even really, I mean, they couldn't get a movie off the ground. And I think these conventions baffled, especially the actors. I mean, they kind of understood it, but it was still, you're 4 years away from you're 4 years after the first convention, which the actors were all taken aback by its how many people showed up.
And they'd show up for free. Like, they couldn't believe it just to see it. You know, now it's like, how much am I guaranteed autographs to make it worth my while? And, you know, what, you know, first class air and all this other stuff. And it's like, how long do I have to be there? And, you know, then it was like, holy mackerel, people showed up to see me.
Yeah.
And also you had things like, this was very close to the time when they christened the first space shuttle Enterprise. And there was an innocence to this fandom.
Yeah.
There wasn't,
it was before Pathfinder, years before they,
it wasn't commercialized, you know, and it was truly about the love of this show. And the show, it was not like they would never have done a Saturday Night Live sketch about Star Trek fandom then. I mean, it was really interesting. Even
that is when they did it.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
No. What I mean is that wasn't about the fans. That was about the show itself.
Cancellation. Yeah, that's
you know, and how the show was. it was like, we love this show. This show meant a lot. And look what you network executives did to it. You know, it was more a reflection of the network killing something that was so wonderful. And it hadn't been commercialized, and it hadn't been turned into something else. And the fans were not looked down upon.
So you're basically, there's nostalgia now for the good old days when the network just killed wonderful things instead of zombifying.
But it's so interesting what you're saying.
Raising them from the dead like a folklore.
Is when a show you liked was canceled, then it was just like, you're like, oh, damn. And then you look at TV Guide to see what the new show was next season, right? Now there's this expectation. Well, maybe they're going to save it. Maybe it'll go to streaming. Maybe they'll bring it back as a movie in 5 years.
There's a different kind of attitude by fans now, that not only is it an ownership of the whatever show it might be, but it's an entitlement to it, and a position of commanding of the producers. What existed in the 70s was different. There was still ownership, but it was taking responsibility for that ownership and carrying the torch further, helping the producers continue what they started.
Yes.
So it was a different attitude completely.
Well, I just remember, look, I knew nothing about this book, and then I saw it at the bookstore, and I'm like, and it says on the it has to explain what it is. First time published, 8 original Star Trek stories never seen on the screen. Right. Like, it has to explain what the concept of the book is. And I just thought, and how much did I spend? $1.75. And I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. I mean, they even have on the back cover, this is it says, these are the new voyages of the Starship Enterprise, its continuing mission to seek out new life, new civilizations, strange new worlds, William Shatner. And then it describes it says, amazing, never before published stories of the golden age. They had no idea how right they were. A shining living legend of heroes, of great quests, of loves gained and lost, of steadfast courage and splendid deeds. A must book for all fans.
There you go.
You know what else too is there was a reverence about Star Trek. Like, even there was the best of Trek anthologies from the Star Trek fanzine Trek. But if you read these were very scholarly examinations of some of the most minute elements of characterization and elements in Star Trek, and how was love portrayed, how was religion portrayed. And there was a very studious approach to Star Trek. It wasn't looked down upon. It was revered. It was being put up on a pedestal by the people that were writing these stories, which has been almost completely taken away.
Rob, you'll appreciate this story. When I got the galleys, not the galleys, but I got the mock-up for my Battlestar Galactica book. So say we all. I hate it, the cover. I absolutely hate it. Ed Gross hated the cover. I called my editor and I said the most horrible thing I thought I could muster. This looks like a best of Trek cover, and he had no idea what I was talking about. I said, this is so bad. It looks just like those old best of Treks, because of course they didn't have the license to Star Trek. It was New American Library that put out the best of Trek. So they did these weird generic spaceships on the cover,
like John Berkey paintings or something.
Yeah, and in retrospect now it's like, oh, the best of Trek. It was so great. But man, at the time, those covers were all ridiculous, right? But you're right, it was a fantastic series of books, because they thought about Star Trek with a complexity and a rigorousness that some of us approach Star Trek these days.
Yes.
Well, the thing I think one of the big things that's different that we cannot discount, right, is part of the Roddenberry marketing machine, and the machine that is Roddenberry for marketing, that kind of kept the flame alive in some ways, was his college tour and his continually sort of, repeating, his lines about the sort of the philosophical underpinnings of the show, like, I think, which are more or less true. Obviously we've talked a lot about, like, how much of what Gene said was actually reflected in what the show actually was, and how did it vary, when the rubber met the road in terms of the stories. But what was presented to fandom, especially fandom of particular age, right? And the fandom that was going to go out into the world and organize these things and do these things was that Star Trek was an intellectual exercise.
Yes.
And so I think it was carried, a lot of it was carried forward from that.
I don't want this to fall into that Sarlacc pit of being, oh, they're just nostalgic. Oh, the good old days. This is, because that's not what I want this episode to be.
No.
I think that this is a very sort of cool, the beginning of something that you see, in a lot of franchise IP now that all can be traced back to this, space seed that was planted by Bantam Books in 1976. So I want to ask you, Rob talked about his favorite story was called Mind Sifter, which the writer took, Ruth Berman, from a line in Errand of Mercy and expanded it into a really terrifying novella.
Yes.
What else can you tell us about that? And then I want to ask the other guys what their favorite stories in this collection were.
Well, what it was is it combined certain things. First of all, it used canonical things like the Guardian of Forever, and it used the Klingons, and the Klingons were threatening. They were scary, and they had done this thing to Kirk, and it had import. It was like when I read the story, there was real peril. I mean, Kirk was obviously my hero, and to have this done to him, it was really distressing. When I read the story, it was a very scary story, and it really, it was not your normal bill of fare, because it seemed like this plot was really evil on the part of the Klingons, and I really enjoyed it. It was a sprawling story, but then it also showed Kirk's heroic side, and it was just this wonderful. It was a wonderful story, and what. Here's the thing that it's hard to explain to people now, because all of this stuff was elevating what Star Trek was. No one at this time, none of the people that wrote these essays or wrote these books would look at something like the Mugatu from A Private Little War and make fun of it. For these people, a Mugatu is just a Mugatu. They didn't be like, well, they had to solve production problems, so they used a white ape suit with a horn on the head. You took it seriously. You're like, on this planet, this creature exists. So you never, nowadays you talk to people about Star Trek, 50 years on, and there is an element that you can't penetrate where people look back and with a smile, and it's kind of a goof. They can no longer look at Star Trek objectively. They can only see it through the lens of they're in a position where Star Trek is beneath them in some way.
There is a layer of disdain that has grown from being made fun of.
Yes. And it's very frustrating. And at the time when this book came out, I revered Star Trek. Yeah. And everybody that was writing these stories or was buying these books or going to conventions, we could embrace the goofiness, but we still revered each story for what it was. And there wasn't a postmodern slant to our enjoyment of these stories.
Right. And for those of you who are interested, Mind Sifter was turned into a screenplay and produced by James Cawley's New Voyages fan films. And they did that episode, and it's quite good. You can look it up.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's really cool.
Yes.
Yep.
That's great. Okay, so Ashley, do you have a favorite story in the collection?
So obviously, other than the one that we're talking about, Mind Sifter is great. By the way, what Mind Sifter, I wouldn't say that it reminds me of this. Far Beyond the Stars. I always think about that when I think about Mind Sifter.
Yeah.
They have a lot in common. Obviously, they're very different stories with different intentions, but they share a vibe, and they share a thing in the premise that I think is very cool. And it works both ways. It's just a terrific premise. And it's actually it's a weird thing to say, for fan fiction, I think it's actually pretty well executed. I will tell you what I personally appreciate. And the beauty of it is it's ridiculously short. It's so short, I could even read it to you. There is a sonnet that ends the book.
Yeah.
And it is though it is Spock writing it to Pring. And here's what's great about a sonnet. Okay, what's difficult about the form is that it has very specific structural requirements. It's both like the number of syllables, and it's the scheme, and then it's like how many lines, and it is a very logical form of poetry that expresses an emotion, which I think is like, it's brilliant in a meta way, like on its face that somebody came up with it. But it's called Sonnet from the Vulcan. Omicron Ceti 3. I thought the memory of you was gone. I thought it buried underneath the years, but now it rises bright as Vulcan dawn, and I remember you and Earth and tears. Your tears were falling like the rains of Earth. You were the storms and roses of Earth's spring. You could not know that almost from my birth, the rights of Vulcan bound me to T'Pring. I could not break those ties. I had no choice. Returned to space, left you and Earth behind. But still I heard the echo of your voice, found rain and wind and roses in my mind. You told me that you loved me, and you cried. I said I had no feelings, and I lied. How great is that?
Come on, dude. That's better than the last.
Written to Layla Kalomi.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that. Come on, man. It's like that. I have to like give that like a stand up and cheer for the execution. If nothing, like, but it's really well done. It's really well written, and it's like, and it's the last thing I expect to find in a collection.
Because you know why? This fan fiction was written by adults.
Mm-hmm. Grown ass adults.
Yeah, who already had experience and could fold that into their creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And the creativity wasn't just being driven by Star Trek. It was being driven by life experience and other things. So that's the difference. It's not just feeding on Star Trek. It's not just creating carbon copies of Star Trek.
It's what we're bringing into Star Trek.
Yes.
To make Star Trek reflect us.
Additive.
Yes.
It's additive.
Yes.
By the way, that was beautifully written.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it really is.
Not badly read.
Darren,
No, well done.
Do you have? Is there a story that speaks to you, Darren, in the collection?
Not especially, probably because I came to it so late. But the one that we're going to talk about in depth and maybe read some sections of is so much fun and so much a precursor to one of our favorite films of the last 25 years, Galaxy Quest. And that is Visit to a Weird Planet Revisited.
Right.
Which is basically the premise of Galaxy Quest with a different twist and a different way of getting into it, obviously. But it's really creative, and it's really fun as a thought experiment to think of how it would have been produced in the day.
It was also co-written by Gene Laura, who went on to write 2 original series Star Trek novels and 2 Next Generation novels for Pocket.
Right.
And of course, this is the story of how the actors, Bill Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, and DeForest Kelley suddenly find themselves, as they're filming an episode of Star Trek, we don't know which one, they're in the transporter room and suddenly find themselves on board the real Enterprise. In the 23rd century, and have to pass themselves off. So it's Mirror Mirror meets Galaxy Quest.
Yeah.
And it's just a fabulous bit of fun. The story gets an introduction from Majel Barrett. What's interesting is this was a sequel to Visit to a Weird Planet, which had been written, which is about Kirk, Spock, and McCoy finding themselves on the set of Star Trek.
Right.
Which I have not read.
I have not read it either.
Because it is not in this volume.
Yeah, I think it was only published in a fanzine.
Yeah.
And a very early one. Although I think you can actually find it online. Somebody scanned it.
I'm sure.
I'll tell you what I think is the missed opportunity of this story and of Galaxy Quest. That I think, though, it's what somebody said towards the beginning of this particular episode, that the fans tend to think, or there's a subset of fans who think that the shows are basically the actors. Well, there it sits, right? The truth of the matter is, the interesting version of this story isn't that Shatner and Nimoy and DeForest Kelley all go to the Enterprise. The interesting version of this story is that Gene Coon and DC Fontana find themselves on the Enterprise. They're the people who could have figured out the problems, right? Like, I've got your Captain Kirk and your Mr. Spock right here. It's like where's that story? Where's that Star Trek story where the writers wind up on the bridge? Right?
Yeah, they'd be throwing the brig right away.
Yeah, exactly.
You'd have to get through all the whining first.
I'm cold. Where are the snacks?
Yeah.
All you have is chicken sandwich and coffee. This is ridiculous.
How about if we read a little excerpt of this, like right after they find themselves beamed aboard the Enterprise.
Okay.
But the hope that this take would go right was promptly spoiled. For a moment, the actors wondered if they were fainting. There were spots before their eyes and they felt dizzy, as if they'd been kneeling and then had stood up too quickly. But their vision cleared and they were still standing on the transporter platform. Shatner, hoping to salvage the take, stepped forward and said authoritatively, "Scotty, get a report on that power source and meet me in the briefing room." "Power source, Captain?" said the man behind the panel in a tone of utter bewilderment. "There goes the take," muttered Nimoy disgustedly. "What's the matter with you, Jimmy?" "The captain's all right to all appearances, but begging your pardon, Mr. Spock, are you?" Nimoy suddenly noticed that they were in a room with 4 walls and a ceiling, and with no camera or lights around, except for the normal room lighting apparently coming out of concealed ceiling panels. Nimoy dropped characterization and broke into a wide grin as he looked around. "Beautiful," he said. "Whose idea was this? Justman's? This mock-up must have cost a mint. How'd you get us here?" I think there's something wrong," said Kelly. "Aye, Doctor, there is that, seemingly." "How about dropping the accent?" said Nimoy. "Mr. Spock!" Lieutenant Commander Montgomery Scott blazed with righteous indignation. Kelly spoke quickly. "Captain, will you give me a hand getting him to sick bay?" Shatner nodded, and they each took one of Nimoy's arms, prepared to hustle him out into the corridor. By this time, however, he too had counted up the costs of scene design and construction. James Doohan could have gone on improvising in the tones of outraged Scottishness all day without breaking, but Matt Jeffries just didn't have the budget to have built the room they were in. The door swooshed open at their approach, and all 3 knew, even before they got past it, that they were on board the Enterprise. The pneumatic door sound was supposed to be added by Glenn sound. They had never before heard it in real life. The door swooshed shut behind them, and they stood still for a moment, feeling totally lost. "Nice going, D," said Shatner, trying to recover some poise. "Now, how the hell do we find sickbay?" "Go to the elevator and say sickbay," suggested Kelly. "Yeah," said Nimoy. "That's right. They work on voice commands, don't they? Sorry, I blew it." "Well," said Shatner, "if it weren't impossible, it's exactly the sort of thing Justman would pull." "Sort of thing you'd pull as far as that goes, if you thought you could break me up," Nimoy grumbled. And it goes further, but what a great little introduction to them finding themselves where no man has gone before.
It's a great setup, and it takes you to a really interesting situation, in much the way, I guess, that Captain Kirk has to deal with the Hawkins in the Mirror Universe.
Right.
In this story, William Shatner has to deal with Kor, which is confronting the Enterprise, which is just so delicious.
And he has to deal with Nimoy.
Yes. Yeah. And what's
Also
great,
hilarious.
a little throwaway is, how Nimoy is very excited to look through the little blue scanner and see what's really in there. What's Spock seeing?
It's so well done, and the little asides mentioning the actual people who did these jobs is really fun and sort of almost like inside baseball.
Well, what's interesting about the inside baseball of it, and think about this for a second, in the internet age, it's fairly easy to know things, right? It's fairly easy to know, like, who designed the Enterprise and who did this and who did that and who's the post house and if you want to know this shit, like, you can know it. But when these stories were published, it wasn't necessarily easy to know this stuff.
Oh,
but you have no. I mean, look in the case of Star
had
Trek.
the Bible.
Yes, exactly.
Had
Now,
the making of Star Trek.
Yeah.
But you had to. It's a very particular thing about Star Trek fandom, right? That is the kind of thing that you would be able to acquire, that you would go out and acquire. There was a certain like being in the club to the whole thing that's very different, like from almost anything else that set the tone for what fandom is now. Except again, now like it's easy.
It's ubiquitous. Yeah, and there was no making of Gunsmoke book.
Yeah, exactly. Nobody would have like had an aside about like, it was more expensive than a saloon that whoever the hell built the saloon would have built. Yeah.
Right.
A funny thing too about this story is it's the ultimate wish fulfillment for everybody who is reading it. We're like,
except for Gene Coon.
Well,
yeah, well, I mean,
I wish that happened to me. Why can't I be on the Enterprise?
It's particularly apt for Darren Doctorman, who will be leaving us later this week to wing his way to Ticonderoga, New York, where
Indeed.
he'll once be escorting.
Once again, I find myself on board the Enterprise,
escorting Bill Shatner around the Enterprise. And I mean, what they should do is have like midnight tours where you find yourself themed on the Enterprise in the 23rd century, and have everything rigged up, and then they can have people playing the character. You could do a whole thing. It'd be like laser tag, except with you suddenly find yourself on board the Enterprise.
and you may ask yourself, well, how did I get here?
I don't know. I don't think it's such a bad idea. Talk about the ultimate Star Trek experience, to find yourself on those sets. It's pretty extraordinary. We talked about two really great stories. The book is not without its missteps. Obviously, there's some Mary Sue stories.
Yeah.
I'm looking at you, Enchanted Pool. Spock gazes into the magic waters and sees an exquisite wood nymph, his true love. So I mean, there is a fair share of that going on here as well. But the fun, the fun of these other stories really are what makes it. There's nothing fun about Mindsifter, but
Spock is my lover, and I must kill him.
I want to hug him and love him and squeeze him.
And I love Shatner's introduction to Mindsifter too, because of course, he says he talks a lot about if he ever got to play Kirk again, how he would do it and how the character would evolve, which is great in retrospect. But he also says this story asks the question: what remains of a man when nothing is left to him? Nothing but his most basic self. If the answer it gives is for Kirk is true, and this is some of what people saw in Kirk and in his world, then perhaps that is part of the answer to why people in our world still care. And perhaps that caring is not so strange after all. I would like to think so. So there
it's pretty amazing that you have these glimpses of Shatner back in the day. Also, if you read the making of the Star Trek the Motion Picture, the Return to Tomorrow book that Creature Features published, it was a double issue from Cinefantastique. The interviews with Shatner are incredible.
Yeah, what I love about that book, and we've covered it here on the show with Preston, is obviously this is not a book that's told in retrospect.
Right.
It was written contemporaneous with the making of Star Trek the Motion Picture, and that's what's so interesting, because before everybody started to change their stories, or their memories started to evolve.
It was written before things started going horribly wrong.
Right.
Which is hilarious.
Yeah.
Yep.
Gene also wrote a foreword for this book, and it's lovely that he does. I mean, he's viewers like this have proved there is a warm, loving, and intelligent life form out there, and that it may even be the dominant species on the planet. That is the highest compliment and the greatest repayment that they could give us. Gene Roddenberry.
That's cool.
So,
no,
that's
it's
lovely.
It's incredible.
And I hope, even though it isn't licensed, that I'll see some money from it.
And of course, many years later, I know that Pocket Books did something similar. They printed a collection of short stories. Our good friend Jeff Bond, I believe, had a story in one of those.
Absolutely.
And he was very excited about it.
Yeah, they published 10 volumes of those.
Oh, really? Oh, really?
Yeah. I have them all right over there.
Of course you do.
Bet you do.
So, I mean, this was an era, Star Trek Lives, the new Voyages, the blueprints, technical manual. And it was also the way that, obviously what was so great about the blueprints at the time were the fact that it was packaged in this, snap case. Yeah. And then you could take the blueprints out and open them up. And, it wasn't just like in a standard book. Well, it was the way it was disseminated.
Along those lines, the technical manual was interesting because, at least in the version that I got, you could take out the cardboard cover of it and write the book. And at that moment, it becomes an in-universe book.
Yep.
And right, the blueprints to the Enterprise were as well once you took them out of the pouch.
Right.
Because they were done as if they were real blueprints.
Yeah. Yes.
Which is so great, because I think that ultimately circles back to why people are obsessed with canon, why people love and embrace canon, because they want to believe this universe is real. And when you break canon, you shatter the illusion.
Right.
And that was, they understood that in the 70s, didn't they? I mean, you're right. When you take the card out of the slipcase on the technical manual, which is Bantam books, $6.95, whatever, it just says Starfleet technical manual. Yeah. You can dispense with that, and then it feels like you're holding a prop from the 23rd century. It's the same thing with the blueprints.
An artifact from the future.
But the funny thing is that the people that made it thought that way.
Yeah.
That like they were thinking, you had people that were designing this, and they thought to themselves, what if this felt like it was real? Because it was real. I mean, and in a way, even though I've always said Star Trek is a period piece for a history or a future that never happened, for us it was, and no one looked down on you for I mean, we all knew it was a TV show, but yet in our minds we allowed this universe to percolate as if it were real, and we treated it as such.
Right. So you're saying this little thing they did in a lark.
Yeah,
you put it into a colossal waste of time.
But here's the thing. Even though we all work in TV and movies and a professional capacity, we still want to recapture that magic of believing it's real, right? Yes. Even though we've all built on sets, filmed on sets, written, produced, directed, edited, and been a part of creating that illusion for hundreds of thousands, millions of fans. It's still, we want to recapture that experience of 1976 of it's Fox Mulder. I want to believe.
Exactly. I was just going to say that, you bastard.
But and I'll tell you something, they carried that ethos into the making of Star Trek the Motion Picture. Yeah. And when you look at David Kimball's cutaway of the Enterprise, it's all functional. Like they took time, I mean, between what Mike Miner was doing and Andy Probert was doing and all the designers, and they were trying to extrapolate how can we make this feel of a piece with the original series?
How can we make it fit?
How do we make it fit? And that every single decision in terms of its design work and all of that was considered. And even when you saw the motion picture, I mean, I was 12 when it came out. My entire life up to that point as a lifelong Star Trek fan was believing this. And it wasn't until when, Star Trek 2 is when it really started to change. Yeah. And this idea that the disbelief, or what does it matter? Let's make it more it's a movie.
I just make it fun. It's okay.
Yeah, it started to change. And I would say that from 1966 to 1979 was part of Star Trek history where the audience believed, and the people that made Star Trek believed.
Right.
Yeah.
And then it changed.
Yeah, that's great. Well said. So true. So true. And, even in the Star Trek, the motion picture novelization, we've talked about this. Gene writes the introduction as though this really happened, right. And, talks about, the 79 mission logs, which exaggerated.
And that the crew was slightly upset with them.
The way he chronicled
them, making them seem larger than life.
And it's so much fun because it goes back. I feel like, in Shore Leave, where he says, talks about the elemental need for people to play, right?
More complex the mind.
The more complex the more complex the mind, the greater the need for play. And I think it's true because obviously we're thinking about things other than just Star Trek, but Star Trek brings us back to the past, and it brings us back to what it was like to be on the playground, pretending the merry-go-round was the guardian of forever or something, all these years ago.
Kept
Not some
calling
guy
the
in a hat.
people who bullied us Finnegan for some reason.
and I think Star Trek fulfills that whole idea of the greater the mind, the greater the need for the simplicity of play.
And what's interesting is that has all changed. I think nowadays people,
not for us.
No. And I think
still
that
simple.
What's interesting too is, but people claim that, oh, it's just nostalgia. You just feel nostalgia for the way that you felt back then. And I'm like, no, what I miss is that people were trying to create something that felt real.
Yeah.
That it wasn't just entertainment. This was this world that you could inhabit. If you wanted to write essays about the ethos or the ethics of behavior, you could, and it would be published in a book like The Best of Trek, or you could write a sonnet and use that form about how Spock felt about Leela Kalomi on Omicron Ceti 3, and it felt real. Like that sonnet does feel like Spock wrote it.
Yeah.
It wasn't written like an author was writing about Spock. It is in Spock's voice, and that's why it's great.
Yeah, almost explicitly. The thing that's, I think that maybe we should clarify about making it feel real is, at least this is how I interpret it. It's not about how it's we want to pretend that Star Trek is a real thing in a real
Right.
world. You know what I mean? It's there's a verisimilitude that's created, certainly, but it's the self-consistency, right? It is constantly thinking about there are principles that make the world work as a dramatic idea, as a narrative. There are rules that the people follow. There are rules that objects follow. Now, sometimes those things change, they adjust little details, but the fundamentals always stay the same. Obviously, we can list a whole bunch of things, the name of the Federation changed. It was just, things shifted all over the place in the original series, especially the first several episodes. But when you start talking about the characters' ethos, right, and who they were, how they behaved, what things meant, that was very self-consistent. And that's a completely different exercise. It's as you said, you're talking about the Star Trek up until 1979, and then what happens in the era afterward. There's a temptation that we have as creators, that what we create must first be entertaining, and yes, it must in all times, in all places, be entertaining. But the more difficult exercise is, how do we make it entertaining but not lose the essence of the thing that we're making? And what is so particular and special about Star Trek, particularly in those early years, is that Star Trek very much hewed to this very singular vision of what it was. I could believe as a fan, as a little boy, 5 years old, the same as my older brother, 11 years old, could believe that was a world that was real, and we could make uniforms, and we could have tricorders and phasers and communicators, and there were warp engines, and that in the technical manual there were different kinds of starships that felt like they lived in the same design universe as the USS Enterprise.
It's very much a historical drama.
Yes.
And as long as it's treated that way, as long as it's treated as if you were writing a story that takes place during the American Revolution, you can tell whatever story you want, but you need to keep within those guidelines of it having taken place in the late 1700s, or else it isn't what you're setting out to do. So it's very tricky. I mean, very tricky for someone who doesn't do this a lot, to think of it that way. And I think that's one of the things that I enjoyed so much, reading these stories and experiencing, the creativity of fandom in this time period.
Oh yeah, and Ashley, when people talk about the inconsistency, like I talk a lot about canon, Star Trek canon, and people say, well, they didn't mention the Federation until later on in the series. It wasn't talked about first. But to me, there's all kinds of different organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have people thinking about, well, that's the United Earth Space Probe Agency. Well, yeah, because somebody probably worked there, and then that agency changed, or there's just different kinds of, and Starfleet is more of a general term, Starfleet Command, United Federation of Planets, Fleet Command, whatever. There's all things that people, it depends on where you worked, where you were stationed, where you grew up. There's all different kinds of nomenclature. And even as a kid, when there were inconsistencies in my mind, I would always try and so did the Best of Trek essays. They would sort of fill in these blanks.
Yeah,
because the real world has all kinds of different places. Like, what government agency are you going to talk about? And it might have been like a decree came down that, look, if you're going to go meet, if you're going to have a first contact situation, you have to start saying the United Federation of Planets. Right. That is the new policy of what we're going to say.
It's like a memo. But that's not wrong. I mean, look, I think
because you had 5-year missions, you had different missions. So people were out on the frontier for 5 years and they came back and they're like, stuff changed.
What do you mean we're the Federation now?
Yeah, I mean, but that's, in my mind.
Wrong, but look, I think that the retroactive continuity thing is great. I mean, to me, it's a lot of work to get to a place where I think that we as fans can agree that at some point, things settle into what we accept as the norms, right?
Yes.
And that when we look at where those things vary, especially in those early episodes, they're just the early episodes that we don't really have to account for that, except what we're accounting for in our own heads. Because what it settled into was it's the United Federation of Planets. Yeah. It's Starfleet Command.
But part of the fun is seeing how those early writers were able to, first of all, recognize these discrepancies and find creative ways around them.
That's right. And then decide, well, this sounds way cooler than United Earth.
Because they were inventing all this from whole cloth. They had the hardest job of any of the shows because they were inventing it from scratch. Right. And the fact that they sort of settled into a groove and figured it out so quickly, I mean, kind of by errand of mercy, you kind of have everything figured out.
Yeah.
That's pretty freaking amazing.
Yeah.
It's really hard. Look at Tolkien, I mean, how many years it took him to do Lord of the Rings. I mean, Gene created a sci-fi universe, and he took a little dash of Forbidden Planet and stuff, but it's a wholly original vision for the most part. And he did it, in a matter of weeks. What we did here, we did in a day. I mean, it's really extraordinary.
But it's also extraordinary because Gene didn't do it alone.
Right.
And he had a bunch of people working on this. And it's amazing that through that brain trust, something coherent came out.
And they all took it so seriously.
Yeah.
So you had, whether it be Gene or Matt Jeffries or Bob Justman, it wasn't just some dopey little sci-fi show that they were getting a check for. They took it really seriously. And even the people that didn't last long, like John D.F. Black, even though him and Roddenberry didn't get along, they were fighting over what they both believed in. It wasn't like he was treating it as something trivial.
Right.
Well, and another thing about the Star Trek universe, and I think Star Trek the Motion Picture in a way pointed this direction, it was evolving and moving into the future. So another thing that was added into your fandom, if you watch the movies, and then by the time you got to Next Generation, sure, were the inconsistencies in the universe irksome to me? Yes. But Next Generation took place 80 plus years after the original series. And who remembers exact history 80 years on? So in my mind, I'm like, okay, things have changed, and Star Trek grew and changed from 1966 to 2005. They were adding for this fictional universe. And I find it sort of strange that it's bizarrely, and I don't quite understand. I mean, I understand from a corporate branding standpoint that from 2009 on, Star Trek has gone back to 1966 and it's been stuck there.
It's because it was cooler clothes.
Yeah. But it's interesting to me that Star Trek pointed this direction where you have this literally a universe that was growing and changing and evolving, and you can keep pushing and kind of what was what it didn't start out this way, but one of the interesting things about Star Trek as a franchise is that the growing of it and expanding out into different eras was built into the franchise.
Yeah.
And then it was sort of that was arrested for a while. I mean, they've tried to do that with Discovery, but they were trying to escape.
Your behavior is arrested.
They were trying to escape the trap that was set for them. Yeah, and it goes in, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of the extrapolation into the 1,000 years in the future wasn't as say effective as one might have wanted it to be. And it's interesting that we want to go back to this, I don't know, the purity of the original series, but the purity of the original series was as much about the place and the time it was created as anything else.
And it was there first.
But regardless of how like the show itself has evolved, or the shows themselves have evolved or devolved, it's almost irrelevant, right? Because the thing to me that's key is what you were saying about what the creators brought to the show, right? What they put into it, like the passion that they had for it, the fact that like they didn't trivialize it. And what's interesting to me, and what I think is reflected in Star Trek, the new Voyages, in a very particular way that's different perhaps from other literary adventures of the Starship Enterprise, is that it shows how the fans fed back into that system in the same way.
Yeah.
That they were creating stories that were extrapolations of the world that had been created for them, that they were invited to live in. They designed, they built, they executed adventures that fit comfortably inside those confines that had been established. And yet, in stories like Mindsifter, managed to expand our understanding of what Star Trek could be. And that, to me, is a sign of a really healthy relationship between a fictional universe and its fandom. It's a give and take, and it's a very particular thing. And it may be that time will never come again, because it did exist in a time when you couldn't know if there would
Ashley,
be more.
here's a question for you.
Sure.
How beholden do you need to be to that fan base? Because look, I'm going to use Star Wars as an example, just because I don't want to do Star Trek.
Sure.
So, okay, we all want Boba Fett. We love Boba Fett. Do Boba Fett. And they do Boba Fett. We hate Boba Fett. You ruined this character. Okay, you know what we love? We love that Anakin and Ewan. They were really good. We want to see them again. We want to see Obi-Wan again. Okay, we're going to give you Obi-Wan. We hate it. It's awful. Why'd you do that to these characters we love? So, like, and yet there's such a wariness to do anything new and original, because
that's insane. And I'll tell you why. Because the most successful pieces of the Star Wars universe, for example, particularly recently, right? The Mandalorian. It's a whole new character, opening up a whole new understanding of that culture. Grogu, a character that we never could have imagined. They're the most popular elements
but the Mandalorian isn't an original character. He's just Boba Fett with a different name.
Sure, except except this Boba Fett, doesn't take a lot of naps and wait for his wife to do all the work. Right? He's out there. He's a single dad. He's raising a kid who's very force sensitive. He likes to steal other kids' food with the Force. I mean, this gets tough. The good news is he can always find a babysitter, and his adventures are awesome, and we dig it. And you know why? Because we don't come into it with particular expectations of what his adventures will be and should be. We haven't spent 40 freaking years building up in our heads who the Mandalorian is and what Grogu should do and what that relationship should be like, with Luke Skywalker or Ahsoka or anybody else, as opposed to Boba Fett, where for 40 years we've been wondering about that guy who didn't say anything except he threw Han Solo in the trunk of his car and he flew away. Right? That's what we've been wondering about. And he turns out to be this guy. Okay, except that's a little disappointing. You can't be disappointed in the Mandalorian. But I think go ahead. I'm sorry, Darren. Go ahead.
But if they had made The Mandalorian, Boba Fett.
It would have been awesome.
It would have been just fine. It's not
Probably
it's
so.
Not that, it's not that our expectations are screwed up. It's that their delivery is screwed up. That's what the problem is.
I think we're actually in violent agreement. It's that it's that, you know, look, there's a thing that sort of happens when you're getting into like, oh, the fans want to see Boba Fett. Boy, they'll really be excited about Boba Fett. Well, then something creeps into your head where you're like, I think I've got to do something.
But that comes from the executive assuming that the fans just want to see something called Boba Fett.
Yeah, exactly. As opposed to like John Favreau saying, you know what, I want to see Boba Fett, but I can't call him that. He's going to be the Mandalorian. And he's going to be
just this once, Kay. Just this once, Kay. I'll let you ask about new Star Trek. Just this once on this show. So my question to you is, you know, they keep going back to these beloved iconography of Star Trek, the TOS era, Picard and stuff. Why is there such a reluctance to create new characters and new situations? Because you can say the Discovery went forward to the 31st century or whatever, but it started with saying that this character is Spock's sister and all this other stuff. So my question is, when I think Gene Roddenberry made a fundamentally sound decision when he did Next Generation. He said, I'm going to set Next Generation 70 years after the original Star Trek.
Yeah.
Do not bring up any original Star Trek characters. We're not going to have any original Star Trek. This is a totally new Enterprise. You don't know our 12th as well. But anyway, so
if you treat her like a lady, she'll always bring you home.
Right. But then at the end, he decides, okay, I'm going to slip D in here to send her off, to give
one
it
of the most beloved moments of Next Generation,
which is a lovely moment. But it didn't hinge on that. That was sort of like,
and they never said it. They never said his name.
Well,
you had to, fine, but you had to know. Like, they didn't lean into it. He assumed that the audience would get it.
Time on Star
the point
Trek
that I'm making, this is not in any way to cast aspersions or criticize.
Of course.
What I'm asking is, why is there this reluctance? Is it a marketing thing? You can't hang the publicity campaign for a new show on new characters?
I think they are justifiably worried that original characters that they put out will not be embraced, much like what happened on Discovery.
Right.
And I think that the corporate thinking is that if you wrap it around something that is known and loved, then you can't go wrong. The problem is they are doing Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, but they're changing the original text. So it makes no sense.
That's fascinating way of looking at it. And I don't think that it's wrong. And I think that the thing that's different about Discovery, right? Here's like it's the exception that proves the rule. Is Discovery in its when it was aborting was created by Brian Fuller, who had spent a lot of time in the Star Trek universe. And I think even though he went back in time in terms of just where that show was set or when that show was set, I think he was setting out to do something that was different in its own way. He knew all the rules and he was breaking them in the way that you can break rules when you understand how and why they work. Right. And I think when he went,
you have to know how things work aboard a starship.
That's right. I think that ultimately is kind of how Discovery became what it is. But Picard, Strange New Worlds, like even Lower Decks to a certain extent, like they are all dependent on other parts of the universe that a Prodigy, right? They're dependent on things that had been created before in order to have their dramatic power. And look, there are things about them that like I dig. Obviously, like again, like we all love Anson Mount as Chris Pike. He's perfect casting. If you wanted to find like Jeffrey Hunter in 2022, it's like, well, there he is. Wait, but it's. I think that Darren's right. There's a certain mentality in the development process that says we are creating these shows to generate subscriptions and put butts in seats. those subscriptions will come if people see something that feels familiar and comfortable, and they will stick around for it.
I like
and they
Boba
will
Fett.
watch. They like Boba
I like
Fett.
him.
But here's what I don't understand is, wouldn't audiences rather have a Star Trek show that's created for them in a contemporary fashion? I mean, the thing about Next Generation was, you had a counselor on the bridge because it was the 80s, and therapy was something that became normalized. So you have a character that they never would have created in the 60s because there was a stigma if you're seeing a head shrinker or whatever.
Although, it's funny because their version of a head shrinker was Dr. Boyce with a glass of
martini. But I find it strange that they want to recreate these Star Trek shows with characters that are 56 years old or even older if you talk about Captain Pike. Whereas I would have thought, wouldn't it have been interesting to create all new characters out of whole cloth that represent the contemporary audience today? Because what they've done is they've gone back and recreated the past, but tried to plug in modern sensibilities with certain character traits and things like that.
That's what they did with Discovery.
Discovery and Strange New Worlds and Picard.
Yeah.
And it seems so strange because what they've done is they've unbalanced their own shows, when if they just created brand new characters, Star Trek it was always a reflection of the time in which it came out. And yet now these new shows are created with the DNA of something from a different era, whether it was the 60s or the 80s, and they're trying to force it into the round hole of us. The square peg of the past is supposed to fit into the round hole of the present.
What was so interesting is even when they did the prequel and they did Enterprise, they quickly came to the conclusion that making T'Pol was a huge mistake.
Yep.
And they changed it to an original character rather than trying to make
also character payments.
That's the right decision.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That was the right decision.
Also money.
Right.
Yeah.
They will be rewarded.
But also, the fact that
they didn't have to do character payments because of the era in which it was.
Oh, you're right. Those didn't exist in the contract.
Didn't exist yet.
But the point is, I have no objection to Michael Burnham as a character. I have an objection that they have to shoehorn her into Spock's family.
Right.
That's my objection.
Yeah.
And that it has nothing to do with the actress or the stories or anything. It has to do with the fact that they're trying to put one over on us. That's my objection.
Well, it's a case of wanting to take the goodwill to beloved and
shoehorn it in.
And use that goodwill to benefit another character.
But in a way, but you can't then make the lead of your show Spock's long lost sister without in some way diminishing Spock himself as a character.
Correct.
Because
happened.
Yes, and I think that they've done that, and it is sort of unfortunate, and they've done that, I think, across the board. Yeah. And now they're doing it, they're diminishing other characters in other Star Trek episodes. Like they'll replay a Star Trek episode, as we saw in the finale of Strange New Worlds, and one of the great relationships, one of the great alien relationships ever in Star Trek is the relationship the Romulan commander had with his Centurion in Balance of Terror. And they have this great exchange about the fact that, the Centurion's like, if there is weakness, if our enemy shows weakness, is it not our duty to find that weakness and exploit it? Yeah. And Mark Leonard's alien Romulan captain says, but must it always be so? Yeah. My gift to the homeland, another war. And one of the great things about that entire episode is that relationship. Mm-hmm. We're getting into the mindset of your enemy.
It humanizes them.
But it also, not only does it humanize them, it shows that they're not just evil.
Yes.
They're adversaries that have a very legitimate viewpoint.
Correct.
And that we're watching this going, isn't that interesting? And then when you see it co-opted in the modern age, when they literally replay that episode for the finale of Strange New Worlds, that particular relationship is absent from the episode. Well, they've recreated everything else.
Before we spiral into
no, we're not going to, because Al Neary is closing the door.
Yes.
Yeah, but what I mean is that the point I was trying to make is that when you're trying to bring something forward from the past, because you can't bring all of it forward because it's not created in the time that was originally created in, you're always going to suffer the results of diminishing returns. You're always going to lose something because things that were created of a specific time carry those times with them. You can't recreate something and only halfway do it. You have to bring your own. It has to reflect, Star Trek must reflect the age in which it was made. It has to reflect our time today, because it always has.
And the age in which these new Voyages stories were made was a time without Star Trek.
Before time.
And
Absolutely.
in the before time. And
it is hard to imagine
exactly a world
what that was like.
Star Trek. Yeah.
I mean, we are kind of like the last generation to know what it was like to have nothing but the original series.
Yeah. And we liked it that
way. And were we going to? No, it didn't seem like we were.
No.
It was not the show. I mean, the movie was aborted so many times that you would never thought that Star Trek would come back. And now we live in a world not only in which Star Trek has been resurrected more times than Spock, but Star Wars, Battlestar Galactica. I mean, everything short of Supertrain has gotten a reboot.
Give it time.
And yet, I'm sure Rob would agree. One of the most interesting things I think that's being done right now isn't a spinoff or a reboot or anything. It's For All Mankind.
For All Mankind,
which is
absolutely,
wildly original.
Still haven't watched.
And what's really interesting is Ron Moore has even said, think of this as the origins of the Star Trek universe, which I really love, because the idea that the Star Trek past was our past, it shares similarities, but I never, even as a kid, I never thought that the Star Trek universe had the exact same history
right
our world had, because Star Trek wasn't, the Enterprise did not.
They had the eugenics wars. We didn't.
Yes.
As far as their 90s were a lot worse than our 90s.
But listen, look, this is a very interesting discussion. We touched on something that we try to avoid here on the show, but I'm glad we did, because we did it, I think, in a very mature and reasonable, logical fashion, that whether people like or dislike these shows, I think they can respect the opinions being offered in a very respectful way. But more importantly, this is a love letter to an era long gone of the professional fan. Star Trek: The New Voyages, a wonderful book from 1976 that was the seed of so much fandom, along with many of the other books and stuff that was blossoming at the time.
And you talk about gatekeeping. This is before there was even a gate.
There was no gate. There was no fence. Everybody could walk across the lawn.
There was no gate. There was no key master. There was only Zool.
There was only Captain Kirk's safe number.
It was just the open prairie,
where people could tread across it, sifting minds, beaming up to the Enterprise.
You're beaming here, you're beaming there,
frolicking with.
I'm beaming here.
Spock in the war, but anyway, this is fun, because I love when we can mine these little lost nuggets of Star Trek ephemera.
Yeah.
And this to me was like, I mean, it's been out of print since the early 90s. This book, but it went through an astounding amount of printings. Here, wait, I wrote it down. It was from 1976 to 1996.
Wow.
It was in print. It was, I mean, I have the first one, but it went through a staggering number of printings.
Yeah.
It's remarkable. And and the whole, say what you will, I mean, I know Rob's a huge fan of the Star Trek fiction line. That had a huge part of keeping Star Trek alive.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And I remember reading a lot of those Bantam books and not being particularly impressed with many of them, but still it was exciting to read them. And then the Timescape books were also very hit or miss in the beginning.
But you had a lot of people, like even one of the last Bantam books published was The Galactic Whirlpool in 1980.
Like David Gerrold.
David Gerrold wrote it. So there was that gave that book a lot of legitimacy. And that was one of the I think that was the last
DC
novel.
Fontana was writing novels too.
Yep. She wrote one in 1989.
So
there's one more person I would like to give a shout out to.
Who would that be, Ashley?
So, I ordered my copy of Star Trek: The New Voyages from Amazon, because my original copy is sitting somewhere in a pile of freaking books that I am just too lazy to go through. So I ordered it. Now, when it arrived, because obviously, look, these are older original editions.
Yes.
This came from somebody's library, and I would like to just see if this person is, look, they're probably not out there because it was stamped June 6, 1980. Okay.
Somewhere they're crying in the
Somewhere
dark.
crying in the dark. Phyllis Founda Verwey. Phyllis, if you're out there listening, then
You have your book.
this is for you. I have your book, you beautiful bastard.
That would be even crazier than Rafe Needleman listening.
It would be crazier than Rafe Needleman.
That
but
would
it
be
worked with
wild.
Rafe, so
And by the way, I want to tell you out there that we have something very special coming up in a week from Sunday. Of course, I'm talking about the 20th anniversary of Starship SmackDown. This is a little panel we started as a lark 20 years ago that has become this mammoth thing at Comic-Con, covered on NPR, the San Diego Register. We broke out of 2 rooms. We're now in a giant room. We've been doing this for 20 years. I don't know how many more years we're going to do it for. But we are going to bring you something very special. We are going to find out what is stronger, good or evil. We will pit good starships versus evil starships to find out, to finally answer the eternal question that Yarnek posed, which is stronger. So we hope you'll join us if you're in San Diego for Comic-Con. And if you're not, we'll hopefully bring it to this podcast at some time in the near future, because if you have
24th
not
of July.
been able to enjoy us live and in person at Comic-Con, you can at least hear us.
I just like to point out, by the way, that 20 years of Starship SmackDown, 20 years is enough time for Star Trek to become Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Oh my God. Oh man.
You're welcome.
That's a long time.
It's
Was
a
that
very long
constitute
time.
a joke?
And it's amazing because even though we've lost, not literally lost people, but people have fallen by the wayside, it's mostly the original lineup. You know, we still have like Richard Dawson, and we have we have
Richard Dawson,
everybody.
we got Bill Cullen.
We got Bill Cullen. We got what was that? Brett Summers. We got all the originals. So although Kay is not coming this year,
That's true.
I'm very disappointed. But we will.
I don't know
have,
what that says about us, Mark.
I don't know, Rob. But
I mean,
Rob
if you
will be there, Darren, myself, Chris.
What's
Gossett,
even worse
Leslie.
is if we live to be 80, that means 25% of our lives
was spent doing
were
Starship
spent doing
Smackdown.
Starship SmackDown.
Yelling about starships. Fighting
yelling
each
at the
other.
clouds. No, look, you know what?
I wish
Here's
to
the
wear
thing.
an onion on my
A
belt.
lot of people talk about starships, but very few people are as highly credentialed as we are
That's
in
true.
terms of being spaceshipologists. So when you come to the SmackDown, you can expect only the most, upscale, cerebral, discussion, debate, at a very rarefied level. So,
Although I
hope you'll
think,
join us.
we haven't done Starship SmackDown in a couple of years because of COVID.
Yeah.
I never worried. I never ever thought that I could be canceled because of some of my Starship SmackDown commentary, but I very well.
This could be the year you're canceled.
I could be finally canceled and run out of town.
Well, it's funny because we had a panelist, I'm not going to name names, who said to me, yeah, I just I can't do this panel anymore. I said, why not? I don't like the way that you talk about things. And it's like, okay. Yeah, you guys, you're just mean and cruel and
Is that true?
yeah. You could probably guess who it was.
Yeah.
It was not a Gen Xer. It was
Yes.
it was a millennial.
Yes.
And lovely guy. I have nothing
Yep.
but respect for, but it was bullshit.
But isn't that interesting that again, I mean, Starship SmackDown, if nothing else, is supposed to be funny and put a smile on your face.
Look, if we're not pushing the envelope, we're not doing our job.
Right.
That's how I feel about it. Now there's certain things we can't do. I mean, we can't you know, and I understand. I mean, Comic-Con, you know, saying people can't bring alcohol up on the table and you imbibe it in front. Totally get that.
And Mark,
And they very
actually
cool.
have to say fuck so much.
Very cool about that. I understand. You know, they have issues with Chris Gossett, you know, throwing chocolate chip cookies out into Miss Fields cookies into the crowd. I got it. They're very respectful. They approached me and said, Mark, we love you. This can't happen again. I get it. Won't happen again. But, you know, we're going to say what we say because we are the spaceshipologists. And we've been doing this for 20 freaking years.
The panel is the panel. What can be done?
So if you haven't experienced Starship Smackdown, I heartily
It's
encourage
original
you.
Klingon.
We were very lucky to have people like Neil deGrasse Tyson drop by in the past and share their thoughts. And I'm sure we'll have other people, you know, who might drop by this year. But even if they don't,
We'll be there.
we'll be there.
Be there.
And you never know what's
Since
coming
your
next.
sun burned hot in the sky,
Apparently,
I have awaited a starship
and dreaded
nomination.
it. Oh no, that's Planet of the Apes. I've
All
awaited your
righty.
arrival and dreaded it. Yeah, maybe we'll be canceled this year.
What are you afraid of, Doctor?
Would an ape make a human doll who talks
Yes.
about starships?
We make
I
ape
don't
dolls
think
that
so.
talk. Why wouldn't they? Why would no? It doesn't make any sense. That's fine.
Makes no
No.
sense. Makes no sense. Yeah,
To
we'll,
quote Nick
we'll find
Cage,
out. This
what a
could be
way
the-
to
this
freaking
could be
go.
it for Rob this year. Let's see.
Yeah, I got to tone it down.
No, you
Oh,
don't.
don't say that.
No, you don't.
No, Starship Smackdown is the one place you don't need to tone it.
It's true. People already hate me anyway.
Anyway, we'll see you there.
Yeah, exactly.
July
We'll see you there.
24th.
We want to thank you for joining us for this episode of Inglorious Treksperts. This was an interesting one. We just a little off the path for us. We went a little off-road trekking, kind of like a nemesis. With the I don't know what's worse. Okay, I'm going to leave you with this. So, what's worse, Picard in that off-road vehicle in Nemesis, or Chris Pine riding the motorcycle in Star Trek Beyond?
The off-road vehicle.
The off-road
Yeah.
vehicle.
Yeah. Okay.
Because I can totally see Shatner riding a motorcycle.
Yep.
Okay.
I
you
think Tallulah prefers Chris Pine.
All right.
Well, one thing's for sure in Picard season 3, I doubt we'll see Picard off-road racing again.
Maybe like in a little golf cart,
I will find
or like one of
before.
those little scooters that people
The
ride
Picard
around. Have you
mobile
seen
that
those,
is
Mark?
Oh, don't start with the,
The
scooters.
Picard
I'm
mobile
getting-
golf cart that is
The
basically
Picard mobile.
the Bob Hope cart repainted.
You remember me on the Stargazer and the USS Enterprise? Now I drive the Picard mobile.
Oh boy.
Oh my
Join
God.
us
Okay, well,
next
listen,
time.
Rob, Ashley, so glad to have you back with us. Want to thank Mark Rivera, who's been doing such a wonderful job. What a delight that Greg Jean episode. The way you use the clips and everything. Thank you for that. Bill Ritter, thank you. Peter Holmstrom, always doing a great job. Our producer Nellie Miscali, and of course you, our audience, who's been saying such nice things on the internet. Inglorious Trek at Twitter, Inglorious Treksperts at Instagram and Facebook. And of course, you can rate us 5 stars wherever you listen to podcasts, although you may not want to after this week's episode. I don't know. We may get some more nasty mail, but as I always say,
Okay.
them's the breaks. So, if you don't put yourself out there,
You're not out there.
you're not out there. You don't get any mail. You're alone because nobody's responding. Nobody cares what you think. So I don't even know what's going on. I haven't had dinner. I'm hungry. What can I say? But we hope to see you at San Diego Comic-Con. Everybody's gonna be there. Rob will entertain you. He'll take you to bars. He'll show you a good time. I will not talk to you, but Rob will make up for it.
I talk to everybody.
Rob will take
And
your
Rob will
mama
talk to
on a
everybody.
date.
He'll make you feel like you're his best friend. And
That's when the world
you'll
was
have
new.
wonderful conversations. And I want to put the opinions expressed by Rob to you in the bar do not represent those of the podcast. He's his own man. He can say whatever he wants. Nothing to do with Treksperts. So, and Darren will be there and happy to be there and
I'm
give you a
happy to be-
smile and a hearty farewell. And
A Laurel and hearty handshake.
a Laurel and hearty handshake. And I'll wave at you from afar. And
Uh-huh.
particularly with the pandemic, I don't want to shake hands. It's no reflection on you. I don't want anybody to come within 10 feet of me.
Are
Yeah,
you
but
into
hey,
hugs?
You did that. way
No
before
hugs.
the
I don't want
pandemic.
hugs. I don't want handshakes.
No
I don't
open
want
mouth
anything. I don't
kissing?
even want the Galactica handshake where, you reach up halfway across the arm. I just, like you can give a little like dainty wave.
All
That'll
right,
be
we gotta
fine.
go.
Okay.
Yes.
So anyway, Darren's leaving for Ticonderoga. Thank you all. And until next time, keep on trekking and gloriously, of course.
Shh.